Hello and welcome into the Cubs on Deck podcast. I am one of your hosts. My name is Greg Huss, and today I'm joined by both Bryan Smith and Greg Zumach. Boys, we are so back. It's been a hot minute since I've talked to both of you guys. Bryan, I'll kick it to you first since you're first on my screen.
Yeah.
How's it going, dude?
It's good. My kids ran me down my fortune cookie from ordering Chinese food tonight, and it says, "You will conquer obstacles to achieve success." So, whether that means my Wi-Fi struggles tonight or not, I will still be successful in my predictions for the Cubs Rule 5 protection. So,
At the very least, like that's pretty telling for Chicago sports in general. So that's a good, I don't know, that's good to have, I guess.
exactly. We'll take it.
Zumach, how you been, man?
Man, I'm doing great, but now I got to follow that up. It's like, come on. No,
You have no
it's
fortune
good.
cookies?
No fortune cookies. They're not gluten free. Though I wish. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the interesting part, or it's about to be the interesting part of the off season. And even if we just want to focus on the minor league stuff, this is when a lot of these decisions that could have, leading into the replies of why did they let this guy go? Why didn't they protect this person? Why did they protect this person? That we're sitting there in May, June, July next year. Honestly, it's all about now. So I think we'll kind of get into some of that, but it'll be a really interesting discussion.
I'm convinced that the Rule 5 draft is actually for people to look back and be like, hey, like, why didn't we protect this guy? Hey, why did we take this guy off the floor or waive this guy or DFA this guy? Like it's perfect for those angry people that like to get angry in the middle of July or June about a guy having a hot like 8-inning stretch. Not the Jeremiah Estradas, but like other guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, like obviously, if you're like really cooking Jeremiah Estrada level, that's a little different. But yeah, I mean, the Rule 5 draft is for two people. It's for the ultra nerds, and then highlighting in that like JJ Cooper with Baseball America, who is like the Rule 5 draft fan. If they ever got rid of the Rule 5 draft, I mean, I would honestly probably send him a card and just be like, we're thinking of you. Like he lives for this every year. So, he's all about it right now.
Yeah. So I mean, so today we're live here. I mean, you guys can go back and listen to the recording. I'll actually end up posting this one on Monday morning. Typically the episodes come out on Tuesday morning, but I'll post this on Monday morning. But we're live. Appreciate you guys tuning in the chat live on YouTube. Send those questions in. The game plan today is to spend the first half-ish of the episode, and we'll do some conversations about the Rule 5 draft and protecting guys from the Rule 5 draft by adding them to the 40-man roster, because the deadline for that to happen is on Tuesday. So that's why we're doing this episode tonight on Sunday. That's why the episode is going to get dropped on podcast platforms on Monday, so you have a little bit of time to consume it before the protections actually come in on Tuesday, hopefully. And so that's what we'll do the first half. The back half of the show, we'll let you guys throw comments and questions in the chat, and we'll answer some listener questions for the back half of this episode. I think it's a good way to kind of go about doing this. But I mean, this is the first time that the three of us have sat down. Any combination of us have sat down this off season. So we've been doing we've been doing interviews over the off season. So I know right now we have the Riley Martin and Brandon Birdsell interviews. Those are live on podcast platforms. And then I've also done an interview with Connor Noland and with Christian Franklin. Those will be coming out fairly soon, probably the next episodes. They'll either be combined or two separate ones. I'm not sure yet, but those are still two guys to look forward to. Some really fun interviews so far this offseason. So that's been really cool. But yeah, like I said, I think that now is the time to talk about the Rule 5 draft. Bryan, I typically kick it to you because you do such a damn good job explaining the purpose of the Rule 5 draft. So I think I'm not going to change it up this year. What is the Rule 5 draft? Why does it happen? And just give some details on the whole process.
Yeah, so generally speaking, a minor league baseball player enters an organization, and the organization has 6 full seasons to utilize that player as they see fit. The Rule 5 draft exists to give the organizations that they work for some impetus and some, I guess, just a push in the back to sort of move those players up the ladder relatively quickly. And so there's two phases of the Rule 5 draft, a major league phase and a minor league phase. For the really good players in a system, the major league phase is what applies. And basically that means that after 3 full seasons in the minor leagues, sometimes 4, we can get into that, but we really don't have to. Those players have to be protected by getting added to a 40-man roster. Otherwise, they're subject to the Rule 5 draft. For sort of players that are a tier below, they have to get added to a AAA roster that generally we don't see the names that are on that roster, and they get protected from the minor league phase. But the purpose of it is so that teams don't have to sort of have their feet in the mud dragging with these players that they have control of for 6 years. They have to sort of continue to move them up the ladder, continue to give them new opportunities. And I think a good entryway into the conversation as it relates to the Cubs is, you guys all probably remember the Yu Darvish trade. And when the Yu Darvish trade happened, it meant that the Cubs were trading for these players that were at the very bottom of the minor league ladder, so far away, absolute kids. This is the time. This is the year where the Cubs are sort of being put to the test and having to answer, how much do you want to protect these players for the future? And whether it's Owen Caissie or Reggie Preciado or even Ismael Mena, if you remember those names, these guys are all eligible this season, and that's sort of the gist of it.
Yeah, and the whole the reason being, if a player does not get protected, then in that case they can be drafted by another team and go into their organization. And if at the major league phase of the Rule 5 draft, if a player is drafted by another team, then they have to spend the entire season at the major league level for that team to remain in the organization. So a lot of times the players being drafted in the Rule 5 draft by another team is a guy that is absolutely ready for the major league level. They can spend an entire year there. Or in the past, we've kind of seen guys be hidden, right? Especially with relief pitchers, guys that have kind of higher upside guys, but they don't necessarily have to throw 50 innings at the major league level next year. They can be hidden, throw like 30 innings maybe, and mop up duty, kept around because their ceiling is so high, before ultimately being optioned back down in the minor leagues in future seasons and continue to develop. So there's many reasons why a team would draft a player every year. There's not even a dozen players that get drafted every year, right? At the major league phase of the Rule 5 draft.
Yeah, probably. Probably somewhere between 8 and 15 generally, but the number of players that stick for a full season with the other organization is a much lower number than that, generally between, I would say, 0 and 3. So it's one of those things that makes for good content more than it makes for actual sort of major league difference making. But every once in a while it does. And it is something that front offices think about and spend a lot of time talking about. And I think that's what gets the three of us interested, is when a major league front office is forced to make a decision. That's what makes for fun conversation on a fan side. And that's sort of what leads us here tonight, I think.
Yeah, I think that the good place to start is, I teased it when I was promoting this episode on social media, but there's one clear guy that will be protected. You talked about the Yu Darvish trade. Owen Caissie is that guy that's a no doubt. He will be protected from this Rule 5 draft. You want to talk a little bit about Owen Caissie, Greg Zumach?
Yeah, there's really no question that he is one of the premier prospects in the organization. I think the only question this past year was whether the Cubs wanted to occupy a 40-man slot that they didn't, in September versus just do it in November. To the point that it, especially for an organization like this, and especially with how tight-lipped the front office can be when they don't want to, I think it speaks volumes that Jed Hoyer made a comment in either August or September that Owen Caissie was a no doubt 40-man spot. He would be added to the 40-man. The president of baseball operations made a comment to that. So there's zero question. There's really no debate in any of the three of our minds. but also it's because it's well deserved. What Owen Caissie has done at a younger than league level at each of the different slots of the last 3 years has been pretty impressive. Doesn't mean that he's a refined product. I would argue that I don't know that he's completely major league ready yet, but the path is not very long. And what we've seen from him over the past few years has been impressive. He's worked to refine certain areas that at, day zero entering the organization, people had real questions on. One of them was his outfield defense. He's answered a lot of those questions. He's looked really good in right field. He's played like a handful of games in center. I don't think he's a center fielder long term at all. And I really hope they don't even have to try to fake it out there. Truly, some weird things would have had to happen there. But, he's looked really good defensively. He's also had some significant questions related to platoon splits and how he would handle lefties. He's not finished there, but I think he's answered some of those questions. And then finally, just the issues of whiffs. Owen Caissie has a profile of a guy that you can handle whiffs. You can handle some whiffs because there's a significant damage in his profile, damage offensively that he can give. That being said, you'd still like him to address it and work on it and reduce those Ks and reduce those whiffs, and he has. So Owen Caissie is pretty close to major league ready, to the point that I'd actually be a little bit surprised if he's not in the majors somewhere, Cubs or otherwise, in 2025. Fairly early. I mean, if not ever forecasting anything, but let's say the Cubs right fielder, whoever that may be, goes down with a hamstring injury and is out for 2 weeks, Owen Caissie is a fantastic fit to come on up. Just give him 3 solid weeks up at the major league level and then just see what he does.
Bryan, you got anything else on Owen before we head to the deeper conversation here in terms of debates, I guess?
I suppose one thing we should point out is that the Cubs' decision to add Owen to the 40-man roster still allows him to be in the minor leagues. He'll actually have up to 4 seasons where the Cubs can continue to option him to the minor leagues. So this is more just if they didn't do this, another team would have the ability to poach him and keep him on the major league roster for a year. But there's no harm in adding him because they still have the ability to keep his developmental schedule on the same path that it already was. And so there's nothing standing in the way of the Cubs doing this. They're going to probably have to DFA a player to allow him onto the roster, but it was a player that they were already planning to release in a couple days anyway. So this is a mere formality on Tuesday. It is the lock of the offseason is that the Cubs are going to the way you'll read it in a transaction log is they will select his contract onto the 40-man roster.
All right, guys. I think let's move on from the lock of the century, which is absolutely the case. Maybe not of the century, of the offseason, which is absolutely the case. And I think that it's worthwhile having a conversation about some guys that could potentially be added to the 40-man roster by Tuesday that are more up for debate. I think that I'm going to go ahead and share this list with varying levels of probability that they get added. I think the highest probability is that none of these guys besides Owen Caissie get added. Don't you think that the most likely scenario is that Owen Caissie is the only guy? And then there's a whole bunch of guys here. There's not a whole bunch. There's a few guys on this list that are up for debate. No, am I off base on that, Zumach?
Whoop. No, sorry. I don't think you're off base. I still think they're going to pick at least one more person. I really do. We can debate on who that is, but I think within an organization with as much flexibility as this organization has, I think that they're going to have the IV computer spinning and feel like this player A is, Owen Caissie, but player B is that, that we feel really comfortable and we want to add this guy for this reason.
Yeah.
So, I guess we'll see, but I don't think it's going to be a big list. I guess I'll go there.
for those of you guys watching on YouTube live or later, I've got a list shared here. Obviously, for those of you guys listening on podcast form, I just got some names of some notable. This is not an exhaustive list of all the Rule 5 eligible players, but these are some, particularly on the left column, right? Owen Caissie, Ben Cowles, Christian Franklin, Riley Martin, Antonio Santos, Arian Rodriguez, Pablo Aliendo, BJ Murray Jr. I think those guys are if there's going to be other guys besides Owen Caissie selected selected for their contract and added to the 40-man roster, it's probably going to be coming from that group of guys, I would say. Bryan, who do you like most in terms of whether you would add or you think the Cubs would add?
Sure. Yeah. I think, I guess I'll give my pitch right away here. I think that my second favorite player on this list is Arian Rodriguez, who's a right-handed pitcher who spent about half the season last year in Low A Myrtle Beach and the other half of the season in High A South Bend. He was, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 13th round pick by the Cubs a couple years ago out of a Georgia prep school. So he was drafted not straight out of high school, out of a year older than most high schoolers are, but a year or two younger than most college players are. So the Cubs drafted him in a pretty raw time in his career, have spent a couple years both adding pitches to the mix, but also most importantly, I think just sort of growing his body to be more of a professional baseball player and less of an amateur. And now he's a guy who's 6'3", maybe even 6'4", looks like a man on the mound, not a kid anymore. Certainly fills out a jersey, looks like a guy who could be a big league starting pitcher, touched 97 miles per hour in the minor leagues last year, throws 4 or 5 pitches, depending on if you count a 2-seam and a 4-seam as two different. Just a really, a guy who was a complete ball of clay, who's now maybe a slightly more realized, but still ball of clay. And if the Cubs get any inkling that other teams are interested in him, the Chicago White Sox, if the Chicago White Sox are willing to say he's going to be our 12th pitcher on our pitching staff next year, because we think in 3 years he could be a fantastic starting pitcher, then that's just a guy the Cubs should protect, because anyone who could be a really good pitcher for them in 2026, 2027 is worth a 40-man roster spot right now.
And Arian Rodriguez feels pretty Cubs-like to protect. I don't know why. It feels like a guy that has his profile, and a guy that, you're right, if there are whispers out there about him being plucked, then I think they won't hesitate to add him to the 40-man roster. I think that we saw in the different scenario entirely, but with Bailey Horn last year, right? I mean, he's an older guy. He's a lefty. He's a reliever. Different vibe. But
Michael Arias might even be a better example, right?
I was even thinking I think that the Cubs had one very distinct thing in mind when they protected Bailey Horn, right? Like where they thought that in Boston, they thought Boston might select him with Craig Breslow being over there. That's my thinking, is like they figured Craig Breslow would poach Bailey Horn. It's like, okay, if they think that somebody's going to poach Arian Rodriguez, just one team, then they may protect him. But I think from you're absolutely right, from a profile standpoint, I think that Michael Arias is that guy who the Cubs protected last year and added to the 40-man roster. Where Michael Arias was, had he even been to South Bend in 2023? Same path, right? Where he was in Myrtle and South Bend.
I believe
right?
the same path. Yeah.
So yeah, that does make a whole lot of sense if the Cubs, there is precedent there for the Cubs at least. Zumach, any thoughts on Arian Rodriguez?
I mean, I love Arian to the point that entering the offseason, I thought I was going to be the biggest guy on Arian Rodriguez. And then Bryan Smith talks about him so much that I'm like, oh no, I'm not. No, I love Arian Rodriguez. I've really been enamored with his overall profile since he was drafted. That was one of the big drafts for me. And so it was really, really exciting to kind of see him grow and take some significant chances. I guess I will push back a little bit on being as confident about Arian Rodriguez kind of being in the mix there, with saying that I think that there's enough he didn't generate as many whiffs at the high A level as like Michael Arias did.
Yep.
And to the point that, if anything, I think that there's just a different development path for him. Whereas like Michael Arias felt like a guy that it's like, hey, look, it's going to look a little rough, but gosh, you could plug him into the Oakland pen as the 12th man, try to just get some outs here or there. And then the whole plan would just be, okay, but now it's a 3-year, decision on that. Whereas Arian feels very much like this guy has the profile of potentially a future starter. I mean, I think I'm far more intrigued with that whole development system continuing to be fleshed out on him versus necessarily shuttling him to the pen. And I will say that I do agree with some of the comments that Greg said, which is, I don't know if this is true or not, but it felt like perhaps all 3 of the guys last winter were added to the 40-man in part because the former director of pitching became the president of baseball operations in Boston. Like Porter Hodge was a guy that we had a lot of questions about last year.
Yeah.
And obviously we're not having those questions anymore. Bailey Horn, there were definitely some questions, maybe a few less, but certainly from the standpoint of like, boy, he felt like a Craig Breslow pick. And maybe those are the only 2 that I'm really kind of focusing on. Maybe don't worry about 3, but I'm not sure that those same conversations would be having place where it's so targeted. And so he's a guy that didn't do so much for me in high A that I'm thinking, oh man, they have to protect him. But he's also the mix of the guy that if I see his name pop up or hear it, as we hear the simulcast for the Rule 5, I would immediately get like, twinges of pain. So I can understand it either way.
Yeah, if I heard his name, if he doesn't get protected, I'm gonna be like, okay, that makes sense. That's fine. If he gets selected, I'm gonna be pissed.
Yeah.
like I'm gonna be pretty upset. But to your point, Zumach, I mean, the swing strike percentage for Arian Rodriguez this year was 13.6%, which is above average for the system, but not like crazy high. He only struck out 20.8% of the batters he faced. Not very clearly not a super high strikeout rate there. So the profile is significantly different than Michael Arias, but the thinking is probably fairly similar-ish. You know what I mean? So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he also had Arian Rodriguez had a super low home run per fly ball, right? 2.3% of the fly balls went out of the ballpark, which is like super low compared to the rest of the system. So, yeah. So that I think Arian was definitely worth the longest conversation here, given his kind of wonky situation for the Rule 5 draft. I'll point out another name here that is interesting to me, especially coming off the conversation about Bailey Horn, is Riley Martin. I have Riley Martin there. And obviously, we interviewed him earlier this offseason. I think that like he seems more of a stretch to me even than Arian Rodriguez. But if you're looking at a guy like Bailey Horn being added to the 40-man roster last season, I don't know why you look at Riley Martin and think otherwise. But you can kind of learn the lesson. I think, Brian, you might have mentioned that in a text to me or something, where it's like, all right, if the Bailey Horn situation didn't really work out, so why are they going to turn around and then protect Riley Martin too? So I think there's more to Riley Martin than the ERA and some of the standard stats with him. The cut right on his fastball is something we know the Cubs like. We know that other organizations like that as well. The curveball is a very, very, very good pitch. It's an out of the ordinary. Like, you're not necessarily looking for a really good curveball like you are a really good slider, but it's a really good pitch. So he's another guy to kind of put on the radar. It's a lefty out of the bullpen too, which is those are always interesting to find,
Yeah, Riley was really good the last sort of 6-8 weeks of the season, and I think sort of jumped a level, and so I think definitely makes a case for being there. I do think that the Cubs might have sort of showed their hand a little bit. Obviously, this has not been a very exciting offseason so far, but if there was one surprising move, it was when the Cubs brought in Rob Zastryzny, old friend, and He's a left-hander relief pitcher that I think they'll probably try to sneak through waivers at some point. But if they were just totally happy with the idea that Riley Martin was going to get added to the 40-man roster and give them some left-handed relief pitcher depth, would they have gone through the headache of bringing in Rob Zastryzny, releasing Anoli Paredes, eventually to just try to get Zastryzny through waivers? My instinct is no. I think that move signals that Riley will probably be left exposed.
I want to move on. We have some comments actually here. I want to pop up on the screen about guys that could potentially be protected here. One of the first ones we got was about Pablo Aliendo. So Pablo Aliendo is kind of an interesting situation where he was actually brought back on a successor contract. So he was eligible to become a minor league free agent and essentially did, because he re-signed again with the Chicago Cubs. So he's back in the organization, but because he re-signed, he is technically eligible for drafting in the Rule 5 draft. So wanted to get your thoughts. Zumach, I'll kick it to you on your thoughts on Pablo Aliendo.
Pablo's a ton of fun. I think he showed some steps forward this year, probably not quite as many as we were maybe hoping. And just from the standpoint of the Rule 5, so like he could be drafted despite the successor contract, kind of like what you were talking about. But I will say it is very, very difficult, or at least the track record suggests that it is very difficult for teams to invest a spot on a major league roster for a catching prospect.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying it's never happened, it's obviously happened, but the past few seasons have made it very, very unlikely that even as you were watching in live and thinking, oh man, like this guy would be interesting. I think there was one of the catchers out of Texas, might have been Hart or something, where we're thinking like, oh, he's eligible. Like maybe you just take a chance on that. Like maybe that's your backup catcher, and everybody passed. And it's very difficult to occupy a 40-man slot for a catcher that isn't quite ready, that's still kind of working on smoothing out some of the edges, as catchers do, which is not uncommon and not like a negative knock on Pablo Aliendo. The catcher in the last few seasons that it was the no-brainer, we've got to add this guy, is Miguel Amaya.
Yeah.
And that's because he was a top prospect. And you obviously clear the runway for those kind of guys. Pablo's working on things. I really like that he signed a successor contract, because if you told me things click over the offseason and he even forced his way up next year, he could dramatically change and shock me. But catchers need a lot of time to cook, and that's a tough thing to ask an MLB roster to hold.
Yeah.
Here's what you got to think about too. If a team liked Pablo Aliendo enough to draft him in the Rule 5 draft, then my thinking is they would have signaled to his agent 2 months ago that they really liked him and that they were going to give him a minor league contract worth more money than a normal one, and he would not have signed a successor deal with the Cubs. The fact that he signed a deal to return to the Cubs signals the fact that his agent probably didn't have that conversation, which I think makes him getting drafted not completely likely.
Yeah. Also worth pointing out that the way the Rule 5 draft is set up is that players are eligible for 2 off seasons in a row to be selected in the Rule 5 draft, just as Rule 5 draft eligible players before then reaching minor league free agency. So Pablo had the opportunity to be drafted on back-to-back years in last offseason and the year before that, and now he's eligible to be drafted after essentially reaching minor league free agency. So yeah, he's got a lot of things going against him. I think that he's great to have as major league depth in the organization off the 40-man roster. Like that's awesome. That's what you love to see. The likelihood that he gets plucked in the Rule 5 draft is pretty slim, and so I think because of that, the likelihood that he gets out of the 40-man roster is even slimmer, I guess, is where I kind of land on that. So yeah. We got a question from Jacob asking about, other than Owen Caissie, obviously, which we talked about, Ben Cowles and Frankie Scalzo Jr. What are the chances that either of those guys get out of the 40-man roster? I think that Ben Cowles is probably, I know that Ben Cowles is a higher likelihood of being added than Frankie Scalzo Jr. Brian, what are your thoughts on these two guys?
Yeah, Ben Cowles is definitely a name we should spend a few minutes talking about. I think if you had to bet on a second guy getting added, I would do Arian Rodriguez, but I think the sort of gambling choice, if you were going to bet on a thing like
Safer
this, would be Ben Cowles. Mostly because the Cubs just traded for him, right? The Cubs made a decision in July to acquire him, and that was knowing that he was going to be Rule 5 eligible this offseason. And so, and when they traded for him, I should say, he was already injured and they knew that he was going to miss the rest of the regular season. So there was no more information that was going to be provided to the Cubs. So at the time, he's Rule 5 eligible. He's out for the rest of the year. It kind of stands to reason that they would protect him. And then he's had a pretty decent stint in the Arizona Fall League this year. He started off a little slow, then got pretty hot, and then sort of just leveled out and was, in the vicinity of league average, I believe. It's going to be an interesting one. My question with Ben, he's a right-handed hitting infielder, kind of can play both middle infield spots. You're probably looking at non-tendering Nick Madrigal, but you have Luis Vasquez there who fills that same bucket. Are you getting enough new stuff from Ben Cowles that aren't answered by those other two guys? I wonder that. The Cubs clearly liked him enough to acquire him, so they might think higher on that than I do. That to me is probably the most interesting decision.
Well, I think you could also look at it from the perspective of how comparable is Ben Cowles going to be compared to Nick Madrigal or Luis Vasquez in terms of production, but getting him for significantly cheaper. Like his contract would obviously be cheaper than Nick Madrigal. So like maybe it's just a 1-2 switcheroo there for Madrigal and Ben Cowles. Zumach?
Yeah, so I think if we look back in recent years, probably since, I'll just go back the past 2 years, the position players that have been selected in the Rule 5 have been a lot less. It is primarily pitchers, and for many of the reasons that both Greg and Bryan have laid out, which is it's just a lot easier to kind of stash these guys at the major league level. That being said, if you look at the position players that have actually been taken, they tend to fit a couple different buckets. And we're talking small sample sizes, so, one or two guys can dramatically switch things, but they tend to be on the older side. And so I believe, just glancing at things a few days ago, last 2 years, all the position players have been at least 24 or older. Mm-hmm. And a few of them have been on the infield. And so like, I wouldn't be shocked if Ben Cowles is kind of the guy that you look at and you say, here's the deal. We're not going to go out there and we're not going to worry too much about having your 25th, 26th man on the roster be, or the major league roster, not the active roster, be a guy like Nick Madrigal. Maybe you figure out what you want to do with Luis Vasquez. It might mean a trade. Something like that. That may be the pivot point that you end up making. But if you are invested in Ben Cowles, it would make a lot of sense that is the guy that you worry about being taken. Mm-hmm. Far more than a handful of these other guys that have been up on the screen that are like, they're younger, they haven't handled Double-A pitching yet. They have a little bit more question marks. I don't think the ceiling on Ben Cowles is very high, but I think getting to Rich's point, which by the way, was an absolute incredible edit and comment right at the perfect time there. So thank you, Rich, for that, and well done, Greg, for tossing that up on the screen. This is a guy who hadn't really faced a lot of pitching for months because he was out, right? And then he slid into the AFL, which the pitching's not crazy heavy there. But I think it was a pretty good sign that he was able to at least hold his own after a pretty, long stint of being off. So I don't know. To me, it feels like Cowles is going to get added. I don't think it's a lock, but it's just the way they talked about him at the deadline, the way they were prioritizing certain players. They didn't want deeper prospects. They only wanted guys that they felt like could make an ad. They knew he was hurt at the time. And I think what they end up doing with the bottom, maybe that sounds rough, but you know what I'm talking about, the fringe guys at the end of the roster and how they shuffle off a few of them. I don't know. This one, I'm not saying I would do it if I was running the organization, but like it feels like this is a guy that gets added.
I want to ask, I'll kick it back to you, Zumach, for some Frankie Scalzo Jr. thoughts here. I want to remind, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for being in the chat below. We'll probably take, 15, 20 minutes at the end here to just answer some questions that aren't even necessarily Rule 5 draft questions. So if you guys have off-season prospect questions, shoot them in the chat and we'll answer those for sure. Zumach, it feels like there's like less than a 10% chance that Frankie Scalzo Jr. gets added to the 40-man roster. What's the reason why you would, and what's the reason why he might not get added to the 40-man roster?
I mean, the reason that you would is that it's fairly easy to at least take a chance on this guy, have him come to spring training, see if you can work with him, maybe see if you can even get like, if you're an organization, you are the Sacramento A's I don't know, whatever they're going by now these days, and you want to bring him in and as your first or even your second selection in Rule 5, and just bring him into spring training and just see if there's something that you can do from a biomechanical standpoint, if there's something that you can do to just like tweak his arm angle or something, and just get like a tick better performance out of one pitch. Well, that's not terribly difficult to roster. And like, I think that that's perfectly reasonable to be a 12th, 13th guy. But if nothing else, just bring him into spring training. I do think there's a difference in the way we need to view this. Going back to one of the early conversations we had on this talk tonight, which is there's not a ton of guys that get picked, but even of the guys that do get picked, there's not a ton that stick. And for me personally, I would be a team that would draft more guys saying, hey, who knows what they're going to look like come spring training? They may use this as a huge motivating factor. He could gain 15 pounds of muscle, go absolutely ham. And like, the mustache isn't the most impressive thing about the physical profile. And like Frankie could be awesome in spring training. That's kind of the pro for it, right? Like you take a guy that's gotten fairly good K rates throughout his career and just say, hey, maybe there's like a small adjustment and it's even better. And this guy is rosterable. The con to that is it's good K rates. He's been very successful, but in many ways, and this isn't to say that he doesn't have any stuff, but in Major League Baseball and minor league baseball and professional leagues, there's a proliferation of stuff. A lot of guys have stuff. He does have some stuff, but in many ways, he has some deeper intangibles that have allowed him to, I think, play up a little bit. And you just wonder if that juice is worth the squeeze, trying to occupy a roster spot, if there's not a clear development plan of saying, it's not just, hey, let's try a bunch of things and see if something works. It's like, you'd probably need to say, this guy literally needs to do this, and we believe we can do it.
You know what I think of when I think about Frankie Scalzo Jr. and the Rule 5 conversation is back to when I first started doing a Cubs prospect podcast, and I was talking about Dakota Mekkes every single episode. And the results that Dakota Mekkes got every single year up until his Rule 5 eligibility, where we were just talking about Dakota Mekkes and how good he was out of the pen and how the results were terrific and how he looked kind of quirky and all these different things and how he's a fun guy. But obviously like the underlying stuff was not good enough. He wasn't added to the 40-man roster. He wasn't selected in the Rule 5 draft. He then kind of started to fall off a little bit. And I look at Frankie Scalzo Jr. stuff. I love what he gets results wise. I love how he goes about getting them. But like a swing strike rate, I think he had at 11%. His swing strike rate is just not high enough for a reliever, to be selected in the Rule 5 draft. Now the bright side is we know that pitchers can go and make these transformations like you hinted at, Zumach. Like we know that these pitchers can do that. So who's to say that 11% strikeout rate is going to hold next year or the year after that? Or sorry, swinging strike rate is going to hold next year, the year after that, or the year after that. It could be significantly higher come next year. I don't know. But I see a lot of parallels between Frankie and Dakota Mekkes back in the day. obviously different dudes, but just like kind of their profile and how it relates to this conversation about 40-man roster.
Yeah, I mean, the Cubs are also struggling like crazy to sort of hold on to the roster spot for Ethan Roberts, who they really like. Like, they really, really like Ethan, and it's really hard for them to keep him rostered. And if you look at the stuff profile, Ethan and Frankie have pretty similar pitches that they throw. I mean, cut fastballs and sliders, and Ethan's pitches are literally like statistically better, and he's having a hard time. So if he's having a hard time, it's going to be the same as true for Frankie. Let me jump in real quick, Huss, before we get sort of away from the Rule 5 stuff, because you had the chance to interview Christian Franklin, and our listeners haven't heard that yet. So I'm curious, like, sort of based on the conversation you had with Christian and knowing that he might be the guy who, after Owen Caissie, he might be the next highest ranked prospect eligible for the Rule 5. I'm wondering if anything in that conversation that you have that you can sort of preview for us jumps out, or just your general thoughts about him being a candidate here.
Yeah, you guys will see that my big takeaway from that interview with Christian was that he was working on simply doing more damage to the baseball going into next season. And I think that like that matches when you're looking at what Christian Franklin did statistically in 2024. It was across the board really good statistically. Obviously very selective at the plate. Just a very good plate discipline and plate approach in general. Like just really good across the board. Strikeouts down, walks way up. He hit for average. He looked good defensively in left field and center field when he was playing out there. I think that he had the whole package except the power was not playing. Like, which is funny because when you look back at Christian Franklin when he was drafted, and a lot of the conversations we were having was, man, he's got speed, he's got a lot of power, but he swings and misses a lot. And now we're not having that conversation. Like it's the opposite, where he's not showing off the power, and his whiff has gone way down. Like he's swinging and missing, especially at fastballs high in the zone, a lot less. He hinted at that in the interview where he was talking about how essentially he's, as far as like the high fastballs, he's learned, he's just like, I'm just not going to swing at him. I was like, are you making more contact with him? He's like, no, I'm just not swinging. I just don't swing at those pitches anymore. And that's how I've cut down the whiff on fastballs up in the zone. But he kept hinting at like the fact that he was trying to do more damage to the baseball. And man, if he does that, if he works on that this offseason, and he comes back in 2025 and he's doing everything he did offensively, plus he's hitting the ball over the fence, he's hitting the ball in the gap a little bit more, he's hitting more doubles and triples, then he really is a complete player at that point. Like he is now no tools will stand out and be magnificent, obviously, but he'll be good, a well-rounded player across the board. And so like, yeah, that's a guy I look at for this Rule 5 protection. And I think it's a very real possibility he gets added to the 40-man roster. And my thinking with that is the Cubs right now, they have, I'm looking at Brennan Davis and I'm looking at Alexander Canario, two guys that are on the 40-man roster, two guys that their role in Chicago is at the very least questionable, right? And so I think I would be more surprised than not if Brennan Davis makes it through the offseason still on the Cubs 40-man roster. I think that Alexander Canario, I could see him being included as a part of a trade package. Maybe that's a Canario and Kevin Alcantara, or Canario and Owen Caissie, or whatever, if it's a big enough trade, right? And so if you're cutting back on some of that depth that you have in your system as far as outfield depth in AAA, then Christian Franklin might be that guy that comes and replenishes some of that depth during your time in AAA and adding the 40-man roster. So that's kind of my thing with Christian Franklin. I think that what he's working on this season might help him significantly as far as that goes. I do want, since I got to wax poetically about Christian Franklin, one guy I wanted to get your thoughts on, Bryan, is Antonio Santos, because I know you've talked about him quite a bit. You've done some deep dives in Antonio Santos. He's another unique situation where he was a minor league free agent.
Yeah.
Re-signed. He's back in the organization. He is Rule 5 eligible. Do we see him added to the 40-man roster?
I don't think so. He was a guy that we talked about maybe getting added to the 40-man roster ahead of minor league free agency so he wouldn't become a free agent. However, when we have those conversations in October, we're doing it with limited information. We don't know if he signed that deal for next year. The Cubs, of course, knew that sometime likely in September, they re-signed Santos to a 2025 contract. And so they kept him there. I think that they then might be willing to roll the dice that no team's going to take a chance on a 28-year-old in the Rule 5. It is a little bit of a risk, and I would not be shocked if they do it. Santos was one of the most dynamic arms in AA in September. He was really good. He's really fun. And there's no doubt in my mind that he can get big league hitters out in some capacity. Whether it's enough to stick, I don't know. But there's another major league organization that a chance before he pitched it, I believe, for the Rockies a few years ago.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean the stuff is there. He probably needs a little bit better of a slider to really last in the majors. But man, he's up to 98 miles per hour. He's got a plus changeup. He has a slider that every once in a while is plus, and he does that really fun thing of messing with timing, where every once in a while, he'll take a beat longer on his delivery. So there's a lot of fun stuff. I think the Cubs would love to have him off the 40-man roster, but on their AAA rotation next year as a sort of emergency option if a starting pitcher gets hurt in May and there's a doubleheader and they need an arm to just come up and pitch a game. He's sort of the perfect ready-made guy for that. But in terms of committing an entire 40-man roster spot, major league teams really value those. There's a real sort of commodity to those spots. And I think that the Cubs would be hesitant to give that up on a 28-year-old.
That's fair. Zumach, I want to kick it to you to wrap up this Rule 5 draft talk. There's more names on this list that we have not covered. Is there anybody else worth a mention here is there anybody else you want to mention as to kind of keep an eye on? I think we've kind of listed most of these guys, but any other comments about any of these other dudes?
No, I mean, I think they're all worthwhile prospects. Just because a player isn't added to the 40-man doesn't mean an organization doesn't care about them or want them back. I think that is a very easy thing to kind of gloss over. It is very possible that there are people still in I don't know, hypothetically, not so hypothetically, the Nationals front office that would love to take a chance on a guy like Cole Franklin, who maybe, again, hypothetically, they really liked a couple years ago before he was injured. That being said, anytime we start talking about the Rule 5, which I know we've kind of hit into this point a lot, teams are very stingy with regard to 40-man roster spots. They are a limited resource. And so do you want to take a chance on a guy like that? Wouldn't surprise me. These also, kind of like what Bryan has said, these players that have signed successor contracts are less likely to be nabbed for a 40-man when they could have maybe signed a different deal earlier in the offseason. So at the end of the day, there are some really good names here. Names that if we heard on the simulcast got taken, it'd be like, oh, okay, all right, I see that. A lot of them will not be named, or, will not be added to the 40-man. Doesn't mean that the Cubs wouldn't still love to have him back next year.
Bryan, anyone you want to hit on, or you want to get into some of the other questions that we have?
I want to get into other questions, but I want to say real quick, Zach Lee is a guy that has had a lot of fans in the past, did not have a great 2024 season. The stuff didn't step forward at all. However, if he's having a really good winter, if there's a chance that he's back up to 97 miles per hour, his agent is going to tell everyone that's ever been interested in him before. And that is a guy that could get picked. He will not be protected by the Cubs, but, sort of keep your eye on him as a guy that I know other major league organizations have been interested in the past.
I think that's a really good call as far as for sure not protected, but chance he might get selected. That's a good call. All right, guys. Those of you guys still tuned in, send some questions in the chat. We do have some that we can address here. If you guys have any more, send them in. We'll try to get through them before we wrap up this episode. The first question is from Justin, who asked, let me go ahead and remove the screen. From Justin, who asked, which of the top 100 guys would you least like to see go through it via trade? And who would you most be willing to part with? So who don't you want to see go? Who would you be more okay with? Bryan, I'll kick it to you first.
Okay. I guess least like to see go. You know, the easy answer is Matt Shaw. The real answer is Matt Shaw. I want to be more interesting. I keep trying to think
But
of an
what about
entry
Matt
into the
Shaw?
question. Yeah. Matt Shaw is a top 15 prospect in baseball. Top 15 prospects in baseball have been traded about 3 times in the last 6 seasons. You know, I guess if there's one reason why I would be okay seeing Matt Shaw go, it means that the Cubs are getting a phenomenal baseball player, like a multi-time all-star baseball player. And so maybe you could talk me into it, but short of that, it would be a no for me. Willing to part with, I would say this: Kevin Alcantara is on the 40-man roster with an option clock ticking a little bit. He's 2 years away from being out of options, and the Cubs don't have a natural spot for him in 2025. So he's really going to have to be ready for the major leagues in 2026 to be an asset for the Cubs. I think that there's a path to trading him to another organization that might be able to introduce him to the major leagues more. I don't know, like with a little more patience in 2025, that would just be a better fit for him. So as a fan of Kevin's, it would kind of be fun for me to see him go somewhere else that could like give him that runway to really have success in the majors.
Zumach, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna say Shaw. Definitely similar. I don't want to see him go via trade, and I will say this: if we are still getting into this, that I've been having existential, philosophical debates with myself as to whether Matt Shaw is actually even the top prospect in the Cubs system for me. It is like razor thin, and the text messages that I've had with Greg and Bryan on this subject, and I have reached out to individuals outside the organization asking like just deeper things and diving into contact rates and swing decisions from external folks. I still don't know if Matt Shaw is my top prospect in the Cubs system, but he probably is. He's definitely the guy I don't want to see traded, though, because he has the easiest path to providing some really meaningful, tangible, all-star level potential for the Cubs organization. The other player that I have kind of in that conversation is like Moises Ballesteros, because I think it's truly a special bat. But I still have questions on how that bat actually makes it all work.
Yeah.
I don't have those questions with Matt Shaw. And we can say like, oh, Nico Horner. Yes, I totally get that. But I believe it's been like Greg Huss even laid out earlier in the offseason, or maybe it was towards the end of the year. Honestly, the Cubs were out of it at that point. That like Matt Shaw should get like 500 plate appearances next year in Chicago, regardless. And then we laid out how that was very feasible. So Nico, if he's here, if he's not here, I don't know. None of us know. If you do, you're not letting any of us in on it. And like, but like Matt Shaw should have a very tangible impact for the Cubs. Yeah. And so he is definitely the guy I'm not moving. To the point that the feedback I got last offseason was they were not interested in moving him either. Even for some very, very, very good players. The guy that I would most willing to part with, though, and this is going to be something that if you've followed me since the beginning, this is going to sound strange. It is James Triantos. I am a huge James Triantos fan. But because I believe the Cubs are very in with Matt Shaw as potentially a second baseman long-term, or if nothing else, getting a very significant run over the course of the next few seasons, I don't want to see James Triantos buried on a bench or buried in AAA for years. He's too good of a player for it. I think he's got a long major league career and a very good one. And the guy I keep comping him to is actually Jeff McNeil out of the New York Mets. A guy that is very contact focused as to how he derives his value. McNeil was a little bit older, a guy that will have some really, really good seasons and then some seasons where the hits just don't fall, but you just stick with them and you get some good value out of it. And at the end of the day, that is a guy that has a long major league career. And I think James Triantos is that kind of a player. But again, similar to how Bryan discussed with Kevin Alcantara, I'm a fan of his game, and so I want him to have a long major league career. If you told me that was in Kansas City, that wouldn't surprise me, or a team like the Nationals or something like that.
Yeah.
So he's the guy that I think makes the most sense. And I don't know. I guess we'll see if the Cubs agree.
My kind of lame answer to this is I think that whenever I'm thinking about players that I don't want to see traded and guys that I think are fine if they do get traded, it's never about like, oh, Matt Shaw is a top 15 prospect in baseball. Like other teams also see that he's a top 15 prospect in baseball. So like if the Cubs are trading Matt Shaw, it's because they're getting the appropriate value back in return. And so like whenever my mind goes to this same conversation, it's like, all right, who are the Cubs not getting what I think is the proper value in return for these guys? And so if we're talking the top 100 guys, those are pretty well scouted guys. So it's kind of it'd be difficult to not get the proper return. However, I think in a guy that I would not like to see traded is actually the opposite of Zumach. I would not like to see James Triantos traded because I think that other teams could value James Triantos more than what the Cubs do. And so I think the Cubs could be selling lower on James Triantos than what they should be because they don't value him as much as other teams do. And then in the same breath, I think that the Cubs might value Moises Ballesteros more than other teams do. And so if they're trading Moises Ballesteros, it's because they're blown away by the trade offer because I do think that the Cubs might value him more than other teams. And so that's kind of my way of thinking for this. So it does make sense the way that the Cubs value Matt Shaw. It's like, okay, how much playing time is James Triantos going to get? Well, I just don't want to see the Cubs trade him because I think other teams they may be smarter on James Triantos than the Cubs are. And so that's kind of where I stand on that conversation. We do have questions about Jefferson Rojas. I don't know what this is. This alludes
I
to
can tell you.
Okay, so John Clay asked, can Bryan talk more about Jefferson Rojas's contact quality, and can the Gregs tell him why he's wrong? I don't
know yet.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, no, this comes from a tweet I had from a thread that wasn't on Threads and a tweet that wasn't on Twitter. It was a tweet on Blue Sky. And a thread on Blue Sky giving up my prospect list. And I wrote in there that Jefferson Rojas needed to start impacting the ball more. And a couple people pointed out that Rojas actually shows up on an article of Baseball America as a guy that actually did impact the ball more as it relates to his 90th percentile exit velocity in 2024
compared to the previous year.
Thank you. And if you actually look at Jefferson Rojas's like breakdown of his batted balls, he actually showed some real growth last year where he hit a lot less ground balls, a lot more fly balls, and even more line drives, all positive things. However, his slugging percentage did not reflect that, right? And so I guess where I was going with that was it's obvious to us, I think, as evaluators, like looking at the way Jefferson Rojas is growing, that there is power in there. And it was obvious to me that his 90th percentile exit velocity was going to grow as he got up the minor league ladder. That's only useful if it's reflected in the statistics. And so, if he hits the ball 103 miles per hour on fly outs to center field, it just doesn't matter. What he's going to have to do to get to the ceiling that he has, which I think is really legitimate, is he's going to just have to start pulling home runs more often. He's going to start having to have an isolated power of 150 to 200. It's not there right now. I'm not saying that it's not going to get there. I think the reason we're all high on him is that it has a real chance to, but it didn't last year when his batted ball numbers suggested that it might creep up, and it didn't.
I think Jefferson Rojas is just an outrageously good 8th best prospect in the system, right? Like he's. I don't know where you guys are going to stand, but to me, he's pretty clearly the eighth ranked prospect in the system because all the guys above him are just really good baseball players. it's crazy. Like he is. I would stack him up against pretty much any organization's 8th best prospect, and I think he'd probably be better than all of them.
Yeah.
And you're right. He just needs to kind of put it all together, and he's still super, super young. There's still a chance to. It was great to see that 90th percentile exit velocity did get better in 2024 compared to 2023. But you're right. Like it needs to be results, and I think that especially once he gets up to the upper levels, once he gets up to AA and AAA, like it's going to be results driven, and hopefully we'll see that. I guess. We got a question from William saying, who do you guys like as breakout candidates in the Arizona Complex League or Myrtle Beach levels for the 2020? I'm assuming he means for the 2025 season. Who are our picks? Are our picks there? I think I got Angel Cepeda on my mind going into 2025. I don't really have much more to add to that. I've been excited for him to reach Myrtle Beach since he signed, and so. He's my pick. Zumach, is he yours as well?
Yeah, that's exactly who I was just going to say. Yeah. I mean, this is a guy that I think we've talked about this, that there were some very respected organizations that were quite upset they couldn't land him in international free agency a couple years ago. And so I haven't seen him live. I'm just going to trust these very good organizations in how they assess international players. So I think the Cubs got a really good one. They were happy about him. And yeah, I think he's the guy that if he told me everything clicked next year, I'd be like, okay, that makes total sense there.
Bryan, what you got?
Our listeners will probably hear me talk about Luis Martinez Gomez like 6 other times this offseason. I think when we do the Rule 5 episode in a year, he's going to be a big part of that conversation. I think he has a real chance to end 2025 as a top 12 prospect in the Cubs system. So I'm looking forward to his breakout. For
LMG, you got over under 60% of the year spent in South Bend next year.
Yeah, I think I'm hopeful that it's over.
Yeah, I'm gonna have my eye on him for sure. Last one before we wrap this up here. I don't want to get too far into this because I was planning on having an entire episode this offseason dedicated to this topic. So we'll get into the weeds, I'm sure. But just a quick answer. Jacob asked, could any of the top 100 guys start the year on the major league roster? Are you comfortable giving Shaw the second base role if we move on from Nico, or Owen Caissie in right field if we move Cody Bellinger maybe? And so, like, again, I think that this is probably a conversation. I'm planning on having a conversation, whether it's starting off at the major league level or just like how much time is spent for some of those Iowa top prospects at the major league level this year. So we're going to spend an entire episode, guys. So don't worry about that. But any quick thoughts, Bryan, first on Shaw or Caissie starting off the year in Chicago?
Yeah, the Cubs don't have like a historically great farm system, but they have a pretty historically unique farm system in the sense that they have, 6 really interesting prospects all in AAA. And like, to answer Jacob's question, like, if an injury happens the last week of spring training and they need a guy to go to Tokyo, I'm comfortable with 5 different Cubs prospects spending a couple weeks in the majors. I think absolutely, like, Matt Shaw filling in April if Nico's not back yet, he's going to be fine. If Moises Ballesteros has to come up and hit, I think he would. If Ian Happ gets hurt, I'll be calling for Owen Caissie to fill that spot. Kevin Alcantara could be on a big league bench. Absolutely. James Triantos would strike out less than 15% of the time in the majors, probably. It's weird. I don't know how many of those guys are ready-made to succeed. That's not quite how I'm reading this question. I think Matt Shaw is probably the closest of those. But the beauty of the Cubs farm system right now, before they potentially trade these guys, is the farm system is providing them incredible depth for their offense, because all of these guys are more than capable of having a hot week at the very least.
Zumach, I feel like this team, compared to past years, like the chief complaint seems to be the signings of Tucker Barnhart and Trey Mancini and guys like those, like the dare I say Eric Sogard. It's the complaints about those signings, which is they're absolutely warranted. And it feels like right now the Cubs don't need to go out and sign those guys and ultimately fail on signing those guys.
Well, this was, not to get too into the weeds, but like this was the thing. If you were to point to what happened to the end of the dynasty Cubs, so to speak, in the 2018, 2019, going forward into what ultimately required a rebuild, it was the fact that they were spending a really exorbitant amount of money on players that weren't the highest caliber. They were just to fill a role. It was like the fifth and sixth guy in the bullpen is still making, a pretty sizable amount of money. It is the guys at the bottom of the bench, Andrelton Simmons, who I wasn't a huge fan of, is making $4 million a year. You've got Trey Mancini, who I was not against that signing, by the way. I think he's a great dude. It didn't work, but he's making what, like $7 to $7.5 million a year. You're just spending a lot of money on these players that if you can fill internally, either with straight up prospects, which we'll get to in a second, or even just very inexpensive arbitration eligible players, for $1 to $3 million, you're saving a significant amount of money. Where it gets very fun is that this is even another caliber. This is a complete gear shift beyond that, which is it's not even just that your depth can be cheap, inexpensive players to kind of hold serve. It's that these are all top 100 prospects where, probably right away you are still thinking about still trying to hold serve on this. If like Bellinger goes down for an injury, you're kind of just hoping, hey, give me like some good plate appearances, maybe some nice power from Owen Caissie, work some good at bats, see whatever is up. But you also know that there's another level to that. Or at least the league would say that there's another level to that potential performance. And so your ceiling is a lot higher with inexpensive depth players. And I would probably echo what, Greg and Bryan would say here, which is I would be maybe a bit surprised if all of these top 100 prospects made it to, let's say, April 1st within the Cubs organization. Maybe I'm talking for you guys, but I think I'd be a little surprised if literally every single one of them made it to that point. Mm-hmm. But you are still probably talking about a pretty sizable contingent of guys that, hey, this is depth at the major league level for 2025. Some may be actually having a higher level of playing time like Shaw or something. But you are still talking about it's not only depth, it's depth with ceiling. And that is just not something that the Cubs organization has had, I don't know, in a really long time.
Depth with ceiling is that's a new name of this podcast. Depth with ceiling. That's good.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, if I could get like Jed Hoyer to like slip that into a press conference, I will feel very fulfilled.
That feels like one that if he said one time in a press conference, that he would say it 12 times.
Yeah, it wouldn't be one time. That's a very good point.
Yeah, but all right, guys. Looks like we got the GOAT Sam Wiederhalf joining us in the chat. So if you guys are excited for some Myrtle Beach Pelicans baseball, Sam, you missed us chatting about some breakout guys. You're gonna get to see on Hal Cepeda next year. That's gonna be exciting. So. All right, guys. Anything else that you want to hit on before we put the final touches on this episode? Okay.
Too open-ended for us, Greg.
Yeah, that's fair. I got to be more direct with you boys. Zumach, you want to plug yourself? We got some new social media we can plug. Zumach, what you got?
Yeah, gosh. I guess if you want to follow my skeets, which I believe is the official term on Blue Sky. I'm still not quite all the way there.
I'm not in on that.
Yeah.
Don't tell Brett Taylor.
I've never heard someone say it, and I never want to hear it again.
That's right. That sounds good. You can block me on Blue Sky at any time. But no, I'm trying to toss up some stuff on Twitter, X, whatever. I'll never call it X, really, seriously. And Blue Sky. And then, the folks that follow us definitely know that you can connect with us on the Discord 1060 West. If you are looking for an invite, please let us know. We're happy to extend that at this time. It's a pretty tight-knit community, but it's a good community. It's one that we really foster a lot of positive discussion, and you don't have to come in as an expert, but I think we have some really good conversations on there. So happy to talk baseball, and I think it'll be a very interesting offseason.
Bryan, what about you?
Yeah, also join the Blue Sky thing. We're trying that for a little while, seeing if it takes off. I was, the marketing people out there would be mad at me because I changed my handle. So I can't say that I'm at Cub Prospects anymore, so I just changed it on the YouTube for you guys to see it. It's what I am on Blue Sky is at Cub Smith. So if you want to find me on there, that's where I am, as well as the Discord. And yeah, we're gonna start getting rolling this week. The off season will have action starting on Tuesday, and looking forward to talking about it with Cub fans anywhere.
Are you so real quick? So is it Cub Smith and not Cubs Myth? I mean,
I was thinking.
I know. Yeah, we're playing games with you guys.
Oh man! All right, guys. Yeah, you can. I'm also on Blue Sky now. At Out of the Vines, the same as the old Twitter. I'm still on Threads in case that ends up taking off. I don't know. We'll see. Blue Sky's been taking off, which has been nice. But you can find the podcast anywhere where you find podcasts. Like I said, go back. We got some interviews going. So whether or not you can go back and listen to Brandon Birdsell with having the minor league pitcher of the year on the show was
really cool.
A blast. That was really cool. Hearing him talk about his pitch shapes and how he manipulates the baseball was just the coolest thing for me. I loved that. Riley Martin, hearing Riley Martin's story is amazing. Going from D2 baseball to already enrolled in his master's program to being drafted by the Cubs, and that whole story was fun. And then, like I said, we've got a couple episodes with interviews with players coming up pretty soon. Christian Franklin got into the weeds on some hitting stuff, which is not always easy to do, to talk hitting. It's a lot easier to talk pitching. And so hearing him talk hitting was really, really cool. So be on the lookout for that, as well as an interview with Connor Noland, who if Brandon Birdsell didn't break out the way he did, I think we would have been talking a lot more about Connor Noland this year. And so for him to come on the show, it was fun chatting with him as well. So those two interviews and both of those guys are both Arkansas guys. So that was kind of fun to talk some Razorback baseball. So, and Connor Noland, I don't know if you guys knew, Connor Noland was a football player at Arkansas as well. He started a game his freshman year at Arkansas.
Really?
He was a starting quarterback for the homecoming football game at the University of Arkansas.
At Arkansas? Holy crap.
Yeah, his freshman year. So
God.
got plenty of good conversation about that, which I just thought that was amazing to hear some of that information from him. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be fun. Like I said, thank you guys for tuning in live too on the Northsidebound YouTube page. Leave comments below. If you could like this, that would be awesome. We're still building that out this offseason. In the meantime, we'll be back in your guys' ears in 2 short weeks. Take care, guys.